what the Temple of Jerusalem looked like 2,000 years ago, Herod's temple. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you're standing at the edge of the Kidron Valley. The sun hasn't fully risen, but already the heat promises to be merciless. You're sweating under your woolen tunic, and the dust from the road clings to your sandals. Then you look up, and what you see stops your breath. Rising before you, gleaming white and gold in the dawn light, is something that shouldn't exist in the mortal world: the Temple of Jerusalem. Not the modest structure you might imagine from Sunday school illustrations. Not a simple building with a few columns, but a mountain of marble and gold so massive, so impossibly beautiful, that ancient writers said it looked like a mountain covered in snow that could blind you if you stared too long. But here's what should make us pause. How did a building become so magnificent that even Rome's enemies called it one of the wonders of the world? What kind of obsession drove a paranoid king to spend nearly 50 years constructing it? And most haunting of all, why did Jesus, standing before this architectural triumph, predict that not one stone would be left upon another? The temple we're about to explore isn't just ancient history. It's the stage where prophecy became flesh, where heaven touched earth, and where the entire sacrificial system that had sustained Israel for a millennium came to its fulfillment. Stay until the end, because what you're about to discover will forever change how you read the Gospels and understand what Jesus actually accomplished on the cross. To understand Herod's temple, we must first grasp what Jerusalem was like in the first century. This wasn't a peaceful, holy city of quiet meditation. Jerusalem in Jesus' time was a cauldron of political tension, religious fervor, and shocking contrasts. The city sat perched on the Judean hills, approximately 2,500 feet above sea level, its limestone buildings clinging to steep slopes. During major festivals, its normal population of perhaps 30,000 could swell to over 100,000 pilgrims. Imagine the chaos. Streets barely wide enough for 2 donkeys to pass. The constant bleating of sheep being driven to slaughter. The smell of blood and incense mixing with unwashed bodies and cooking fires. The air itself was different. Dry, hot, filled with dust that got into everything. The temple didn't just sit in this city, it dominated it. Built on Mount Moriah, the very spot where Abraham had nearly sacrificed Isaac, where David had purchased the threshing floor, the temple complex covered roughly 36 acres, equivalent to about 27 American football fields. But here's what's crucial. This wasn't primarily a place of worship as we understand it. This was a functioning slaughterhouse, a treasury, a courthouse, a banking center, and a theological seminary all rolled into one. On major feast days, thousands of animals were sacrificed. The blood ran in channels. The smoke from burning offerings was so thick it formed permanent clouds over the city. Priests worked in rotating shifts, and the temple employed thousands: priests, Levites, guards, cleaners, musicians, and administrators. The temple that Jesus knew was actually the third iteration of sacred structures on this site. Solomon's temple had been destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC. The second temple, built by the returning exiles under Zerubbabel around 515 BC, was modest. So modest that elderly men who remembered Solomon's temple wept when they saw it. Then came Herod the Great. Love him or hate him, and most Jews did both, Herod understood spectacle. Beginning around 20 BC, he embarked on one of the most ambitious construction projects in human history. His goal wasn't just to renovate the existing temple. He wanted to create something that would rival anything in the Roman world, something that would legitimize his rule and impress Caesar Augustus himself. But there was a bigger problem. Herod was an Idumean, a descendant of Esau, not fully Jewish in the eyes of many. He had married into the Hasmonean dynasty and then murdered most of them. The people didn't trust him, and the priests certainly didn't. So Herod made them a promise. He would train 1,000 priests as stonemasons and carpenters so that no unclean hands would touch the sacred inner portions of the temple. He stockpiled materials for years before beginning. He expanded the Temple Mount itself, building massive retaining walls that still stand today, the Western Wall being the most famous. Only then did he begin the actual reconstruction, and he did it section by section so that sacrifices could continue without interruption. The Jewish historian Josephus tells us the main sanctuary was completed in 18 months, but work on the surrounding courtyards and structures continued for decades. It wasn't fully finished until 63 AD, just 7 years before the Romans would destroy it completely. Let's walk through this temple as a first-century pilgrim would have experienced it. You approach from the south, climbing broad steps that deliberately slow your pace and build anticipation. These aren't normal stairs. They alternate between narrow and wide treads, forcing you to adjust your stride, making you conscious of every step as you ascend toward holiness. You pass through one of the Huldah Gates, massive doorways that tunnel under the Temple Mount. Inside these passages, the acoustics are extraordinary. Later Christians would recognize that these were likely the places where temple choirs sang, their voices echoing and multiplying in the stone chambers. Then you emerge into the court of the Gentiles, and you stop. You cannot help but stop. The sheer scale is overwhelming. You're standing in an open plaza, larger than anything you've ever seen, surrounded on all sides by covered colonnades. The royal stoa to the south with 4 rows of columns, 162 columns in total, each one cut from a single piece of marble so large it would take 3 men with outstretched arms to encircle it. These columns rise 50 feet high, supporting a roof of carved cedar from Lebanon. The floor beneath your feet is paved with multicolored stones in geometric patterns, and everywhere is white marble and gold. But the court of the Gentiles wasn't peaceful. This was where the money changers set up their tables, because Roman coins bearing Caesar's image couldn't be used for the temple tax. They had to be exchanged for Tyrian shekels. This was where merchants sold doves, lambs, and bulls for sacrifice, often at inflated prices. The temple authorities controlled these concessions and made enormous profits. This commercial activity wasn't incidental to the temple, it was essential, but it also represented something corrupt, a system that enriched the powerful while making worship expensive for the poor. That's why when Jesus overturned these tables, he wasn't just causing a disturbance. He was declaring war on an entire economic system that had turned his Father's house into, as he said, a den of robbers. And it was precisely at this point that the temple's architecture began to communicate theology. From the court of the Gentiles, you could see the inner courts, but you couldn't enter them, not if you were a Gentile. A stone barrier about 4.5 feet high ran around the inner courts, and inscribed on it at regular intervals were warnings in Greek and Latin. No foreigner may enter within the barricade around the sanctuary and the enclosure. Whoever is caught will have himself to blame for his ensuing death. Rome, which normally didn't allow subject peoples to execute their own capital punishment, made an exception for this law. Any Gentile who crossed this barrier could be killed on the spot. Think about what this meant. The court of the Gentiles was as close as most of the world could get to God. Nations could come this far and no farther. And here's the stunning thing. This barrier, this wall of division, is exactly what Paul refers to in Ephesians 2:14 when he writes that Christ has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility. Paul wasn't speaking metaphorically. He was talking about an actual stone wall that every Jerusalem Christian would have known, a wall that symbolized the separation between Jew and Gentile, between holy and unholy, and Christ's death had demolished it. But let's continue our ascent. If you were a Jewish man, you could pass through one of the gates in this barrier and climb another set of stairs, 14 steps this time, to reach the court of women. This courtyard, measuring roughly 135 feet on each side, was as far as Jewish women could normally go. Around its perimeter stood 4 chambers, one for storing oil for offerings, one for wine, one for the Nazarites who had completed their vows, and one for wood storage. In the corners rose 4 smaller chambers where Levites prepared offerings. And here, during the Feast of Tabernacles, something extraordinary happened. 4 massive golden lampstands were erected, each one towering 75 feet high. Young priests would climb ladders to light the wicks floating in bowls of oil at the top, and the light was so bright, the Talmud tells us, that there was not a courtyard in Jerusalem that did not reflect the light. Can you imagine it? The entire city bathed in golden light, the temple itself blazing like a second sun. Now remember when Jesus stood in this very court during this very feast and declared, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." The people didn't hear this as a nice religious metaphor. They heard it as an outrageous claim. Jesus was standing beneath those towering lamps, surrounded by blazing light that represented God's presence and saying, "I am greater than all of this. I am the true light. I am what this ceremony is trying to reach." Beyond the court of women, 15 semicircular steps led up to the Nicanor Gate, a massive door of Corinthian bronze so beautiful that while all the other temple gates were covered in gold, this one was left in its natural metal. Jewish men could pass through this gate to enter the court of Israel, a narrow court only about 15 feet wide, from which they could watch the sacrifices being offered in the court of priests beyond. Here's where the brutal reality of the temple hit you with full force. The court of priests wasn't metaphorical. It was industrial-scale animal slaughter, organized with ruthless efficiency. The altar of burnt offering dominated this court. Josephus gives us its dimensions. 75 feet square at its base, 15 feet high, built of unhewn stones as the law required, with a ramp leading up to the top where the fire burned continuously. This wasn't a small cooking fire. This was an inferno that consumed entire bulls, rams, and countless lambs every single day. The smell was overwhelming. Burning flesh, burning fat, blood, excrement, incense barely masking it all. Around the altar, priests worked in blood-soaked linen, catching blood in basins, sprinkling it on the altar, dragging carcasses, butchering animals. In one corner stood the bronze laver where priests washed their hands and feet constantly because everything was covered in blood. On major feast days, the system operated with assembly line precision. During Passover, when every Jewish family needed a lamb sacrificed, the Mishnah describes how it was done. The court of priests would fill with people holding their lambs. The gates would close. The shofar would blow. Then thousands of lambs would be slaughtered simultaneously. Their blood caught in golden bowls passed in relay lines of priests to be dashed against the altar. The Levites sang the Hallel Psalms, Psalms 113, 1-18. And if they finished before all the lambs were slaughtered, they sang them again and again. The blood ran in channels in the floor, draining down to the Kidron Valley below. Now imagine Jesus, the Lamb of God, being led to his crucifixion during Passover. Imagine him dying at the exact time that all those Passover lambs were being slaughtered in the temple. Imagine the priests singing, "The stone which the builders rejected has become the cornerstone." Psalm 118:22. While outside the city, Jesus, rejected by his own people, was being lifted up. The symbolism wasn't subtle. It was overwhelming. Everything happening in that blood-soaked courtyard for over 1,000 years was pointing to this moment. But there was more. Behind the altar rose the temple building itself, the sanctuary proper. Its facade was 150 feet high and 150 feet wide, covered in white marble and plated with gold. Josephus describes how golden spikes protruded from the roof to prevent birds from landing and defiling it. The entrance was hung with an ornate veil, actually 2 veils, the Babylonian Talmud tells us, separated by 18 inches of space. This veil was 60 feet high, 30 feet wide, and so heavy it required 300 priests to manipulate it. It was woven with blue, purple, and scarlet thread, and embroidered with cherubim. Only priests could enter the sanctuary. Inside, in the holy place, were 3 sacred objects: the golden altar of incense directly before the veil, the table of showbread on the right, and the golden lampstand on the left. The lampstand wasn't a candelabra. It was a living tree of gold, weighing perhaps 100 pounds, with 7 branches representing the 7 days of creation, the complete light of God illuminating his dwelling place. The table held 12 loaves of bread, 1 for each tribe, replaced fresh every Sabbath, and the golden altar, where incense burned perpetually, sent up smoke that represented the prayers of Israel rising to God. But beyond the veil lay something else, the Holy of Holies, the most holy place, a perfect cube, 30 feet on each side, the exact proportions of the New Jerusalem described in Revelation. This room was completely dark, no windows, no lamps. The walls, ceiling, and floor were covered entirely in gold, so that when the high priest entered once a year on Yom Kippur, the single lamp he carried would reflect off every surface, surrounding him with golden light. In Solomon's temple, the Ark of the Covenant had rested here, overshadowed by cherubim, containing the tablets of the law, Aaron's rod, and a pot of manna. But by Jesus' time, the Ark was gone, lost when the Babylonians destroyed the first temple. The Holy of Holies was empty. There was a stone where the Ark had been, the foundation stone, the rock from which Jewish tradition said the world was created. But that was all. Think about the theological statement this made. The holiest place on earth, the room where God's presence dwelled, where only one man could go only one day a year, only after ritual purification and sacrifices, it was empty. Yahweh's throne room had no throne. The mercy seat where God met with his people was absent. The whole system continued. The sacrifices, the rituals, the priesthood, but its heart was missing, and no one could predict what would come next. The temple complex included much more than these courts. There were massive underground chambers, 37 of them according to the Mishnah, where wine, oil, and grain for offerings were stored. There were chambers where priestly garments were kept, where temple vessels were cleaned, where wood was inspected for worms, because only unblemished wood could burn on the altar. The chamber of hewn stone housed the Sanhedrin, the high court of 71 elders. The chamber of the hearth contained a fire where priests kept warm during cold nights, and a ritual bath where they purified themselves before service. Everything was specified, regulated, organized with obsessive precision. The temple also housed wealth beyond imagination. Beyond its religious function, it served as the national treasury. Josephus describes how Crassus, before the time of Herod, looted 10,000 talents of gold from it, equivalent to perhaps $750 million today, and that was just part of what was stored there. The gold plating on the building alone represented staggering wealth. When the Romans finally burned the temple in 70 AD, the gold melted and ran down into the cracks between the stones, and the soldiers literally pried apart every stone to get to it, fulfilling Jesus' prophecy that not one stone will be left upon another. But what was Herod's purpose in building something so magnificent? The obvious answer is legitimacy. Herod needed the Jews to accept him, and nothing could buy acceptance like the temple. But there was more. Herod was building for Rome's eyes as much as Jerusalem's. He wanted Augustus and the Roman world to see that Judea was civilized, cultured, magnificent, equal to anything in Greece or Rome. The temple was propaganda, a political statement in marble and gold, and it worked. When Roman officials visited Jerusalem, they were awestruck. The temple became one of the talking points of the empire, mentioned alongside the Colossus of Rhodes and the Lighthouse of Alexandria. Yet there's a profound irony here. Herod built this temple for human glory, his own and Rome's, but God used it for divine purposes Herod never imagined. This temple, built by a paranoid king who murdered his own sons, became the stage for God's own son. Jesus was presented here as an infant. He astounded teachers here at age 12. He taught here during his ministry. He drove out the money changers here. He predicted its destruction here. And when he died, the veil of this temple tore in two from top to bottom, signaling that access to God's presence was no longer limited to one man, one day, one room. The way was open. The system was fulfilled. The empty Holy of Holies would never receive what it was waiting for because what it was waiting for had died outside the city walls. Let's understand something crucial about what Jesus accomplished in relation to this temple. Every element of temple worship was designed to teach one lesson. Holiness matters. You couldn't just approach God. There were boundaries, barriers, rituals, sacrifices. The architecture itself preached separation. Gentiles here, women there, men beyond, priests further, high priest once a year in terror. The message was clear. God is holy, you are not, and the distance between you is measured in blood and death. Jesus didn't abolish this truth. He fulfilled it. He became the sacrifice that the thousands of temple lambs foreshadowed. He became the high priest who entered not an earthly holy place, but heaven itself. He became the veil through whose torn flesh we enter God's presence. He became the temple, the place where God dwells with humanity. When Jesus said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up," the Jews thought he was insane. It had taken 46 years to build Herod's temple. At that point in the construction, how could anyone rebuild it in 3 days? But John tells us he was speaking about the temple of his body. Here's what should stop us in our tracks. All that marble, all that gold, all those sacrifices, all that blood, all that careful ritual perfection, it was temporary. It was a shadow. The book of Hebrews puts it starkly. The law has but a shadow of the good things to come instead of the true form of these realities. Hebrews 10:1. The real sacrifice, the real priest, the real temple, the real presence of God, all of it would be found not in a building, but in a person. The building was glorious, but it was always meant to pass away. Think about the disciples' reaction when Jesus predicted the temple's destruction. They were leaving the temple complex when one of them said, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus replied, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." Mark 13:1-2. The disciples were in awe of the wrong thing. They were marveling at stones that would burn and gold that would melt and a system that would end. Jesus was trying to redirect their vision to something greater, himself, the living temple, the one who would never be thrown down, who would rise on the 3rd day. The temple's destruction in 70 AD was apocalyptic. The Romans, under Titus, besieged Jerusalem. Inside the city, factions fought each other even as the enemy surrounded them. Food ran out. The historian Josephus, who witnessed it, describes horrors almost too terrible to recount. Mothers eating their children, the streets filled with corpses, blood running like rivers. When the Romans finally breached the walls, they set fire to the temple despite Titus's orders to preserve it. The gold melted, the cedar burned, and the massive stones cracked and tumbled from the heat. When it was over, the Romans plowed the Temple Mount and erected pagan shrines on it. But here's what we must grasp. The temple's destruction wasn't tragedy. It was fulfillment. The system had served its purpose. The shadows had given way to the reality. The sacrifices had ceased not because Rome stopped them, but because the final sacrifice had been offered. The priesthood had ended not because the priests were killed, but because the eternal high priest had taken his seat at the right hand of God. When Jesus rose from the dead, the temple became obsolete. Its destruction 40 years later simply made visible what was already true. Today, the Temple Mount is one of the most contested pieces of real estate on earth. Muslims control it with their Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque. Jews pray at the Western Wall, the retaining wall of Herod's expansion. Christians remember that somewhere on this mount, their Savior walked and taught and fulfilled the law and the prophets. Some dream of rebuilding the temple. They have the plans. They've made the priestly garments. They've even bred red heifers for the necessary sacrifices. But they're missing the point. The temple can never be rebuilt, not in the sense that matters, not because it's politically impossible or because Islam won't allow it, but because it would be going backward. It would be re-erecting shadows after the reality has come. It would be slaughtering lambs after the Lamb of God has been slain. The writer of Hebrews puts it definitively. In speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete, and what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. Hebrews 8:13. The temple vanished because Christ appeared. So when we observe the Temple of Jerusalem as it stood 2,000 years ago in all its glory, the white marble, the golden facade, the sacrificial smoke, the flowing blood, the sacred courts, the empty Holy of Holies, we realize that we're not looking at an ending, but a beginning. We're seeing the final chapter of the Old Covenant being written even as the first chapter of the New Covenant was being lived out in its courts. We're witnessing the most expensive, most beautiful, most elaborate object lesson in human history. all of it pointing to one person, one sacrifice, one moment when heaven and earth would meet, not in a building made with hands, but in the body of God's Son. And here's the stunning conclusion. You are now the temple. Paul writes to the Corinthians, "Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you?" 1 Corinthians 3:16. What Herod built with stone and gold, God is building with living believers. Where priests once served in terror of death for a single mistake, you serve in confidence because of Christ's finished work. Where barriers once separated, unity now reigns. Where blood once flowed constantly to atone temporarily, Christ's blood speaks once and for all. The Holy of Holies is no longer empty. It's in you, because the Spirit of the living God has made you his dwelling place. The same God who designed the tabernacle in exquisite detail, who filled Solomon's temple with his glory, who allowed Herod to build a wonder of the ancient world, continues his building project today. He's constructing a temple not made with hands, a living temple composed of believers from every nation, tribe, and tongue. The stones are being fitted together, shaped by trials, polished by sanctification, and one day, when the last stone is set in place, the whole structure will be revealed in glory that will make even Herod's temple look like a child's toy. And if this documentary has strengthened your faith, if it's helped you see the connections between Old and New Testament, if it's deepened your appreciation for what Christ accomplished, then share it with someone who needs to see it. Comment below with what struck you most. Subscribe so you don't miss future documentaries where we'll continue exploring the historical reality behind our faith. Because the more we understand the world Jesus entered, the more clearly we see what he came to do. Not to patch up an old system, but to establish something entirely new. Until the next video, and may God bless you.
Go in peace.